Imagine standing at the threshold of your happiest day, ready to share life-changing news with the love of your life, only to walk in and see your entire world unravel in seconds. That was the exact moment Grace found herself in, dressed in the black and white outfit she had worn proudly to her final year defense presentation. She had envisioned walking and seeing Josh's face light up with pride, and then both of them talking excitedly about wedding plans over malt drinks and grilled meat. Instead, what she saw drained the blood from her face and silenced the joy in her chest. Josh sat in their apartment's living room with Rachel, not just any woman, but Grace's closest friend and maid of honor. Rachel wasn't just seated near him, she was nestled against him in a way that only years of intimacy could justify. Her head rested on his shoulder like it belonged there. The room smelled like stale wine and betrayal, and Josh's hand casually draped over Rachel's exposed thigh said everything Grace needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was confirmation. And here's where we pause to reflect: betrayal by a partner is already earth-shattering, but betrayal by a best friend, that's a special kind of emotional earthquake that hits you in the foundation. Grace didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't throw the file. She was still holding the very file that held the thesis she had just defended after years of sacrifice. She just said the words that will haunt anyone who has ever loved deeply and been blindsided by the people they trusted most. She whispered, "I passed," and the silence that followed was louder than any fight. Let's zoom out here. Statistics on infidelity show that betrayal often isn't about lust, it's about opportunity and emotional disconnect. But in this case, it was plain cruelty. A best friend and a fiancé sneaking behind someone's back while smiling to her face. The emotional toll that kind of dual deception takes on someone is profound. Grace didn't just lose her relationship, she lost her sense of reality. After leaving the apartment like someone escaping a crime scene, she didn't commit. She found herself in a dimly lit bar, sitting alone at a corner table with a glass she didn't even sip. That's the thing about grief, it drives us into places we don't normally go, seeking silence in noise, clarity in chaos. Across the room, Ethan was out with friends celebrating a new job abroad. He wasn't looking for connection, let alone love. But something about the woman in the presentation clothes, looking so small yet so composed in the corner, caught his eye. Sometimes we recognize brokenness in others because we carry it ourselves. Ethan approached her slowly and asked if he could sit. And Grace, already disoriented by the emotional wreckage of the day, didn't resist. Sometimes the only thing that makes sense is the presence of someone who doesn't know your history and doesn't expect anything from your pain. What followed wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was two damaged people talking like strangers on a delayed train ride. Grace, guarded at first, eventually spilled the whole story, not with dramatic flair, but with quiet devastation. The betrayal, the years she had waited, the pride she took in keeping herself for marriage, and the shattering realization that even that hadn't been enough. This is an important moment to analyze because it highlights how deeply our self-worth can become entangled with what we withhold. Grace had saved something precious, believing it would grant her permanence, but it didn't. Her pain is a reminder that no matter how carefully you plan your life, betrayal doesn't always come with warning signs. As the hours passed and the wine flowed, Grace turned to Ethan with a question heavy with pain and defiance. "Do you want it?" she asked. At first, Ethan was confused, and then she clarified. She was offering him her virginity not out of love or attraction, but out of a desperate need to reclaim agency over a life that felt stolen. Ethan hesitated, asked if she was sure, and she nodded with a quiet conviction that came not from confidence, but from exhaustion. Real-life therapists often describe this kind of moment as trauma response behavior, when someone seeks to erase pain with another act, hoping that doing something impulsive will numb the sting of betrayal. It rarely works long-term, but in the moment it feels like survival. They went upstairs, and it wasn't romantic. It wasn't loud or passionate. It was silence meeting silence. It was two people carrying grief like second skin and finding a few hours where nothing needed to be said or felt. By the next morning, Grace was gone. No note, no name, no trace. Just a rumpled sheet and a memory that Ethan would carry for years without knowing why it mattered so much. Grace, meanwhile, returned to her world with guilt trailing her every step. Her carefully built life was now a collapsed bridge behind her, and all she had left was a decision she couldn't undo. But as we'll soon discover, life wasn't done with either of them, not even close. The morning after that quiet storm in a hotel room, Grace returned to her hostel with the weight of her decision hanging from her shoulders, like drenched clothes clinging to skin. Her shirt was rumpled, her face puffy from tears, and no sleep, and every step felt like she was dragging regret up a mountain she didn't ask to climb. She locked the door behind her, sat on the bed, and stared at the wall as if it owed her answers. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful, it was accusatory. In moments like this, people often question their worth, their identity, their dignity. And that's where Grace found herself. Her world was already broken from the betrayal, but now it felt stained, permanently altered by a choice she didn't know how to explain to herself. Realistically, many women in the aftermath of betrayal make decisions that surprise even themselves. Psychology calls this post-traumatic impulsivity. It's not about being reckless, it's about trying to reclaim something, anything that still feels like yours. For Grace, that something was control. But control doesn't erase consequences. A few weeks later, Grace's mother shattered whatever pieces of composure she had managed to put together. The family had already been planning the wedding. Money had exchanged hands. Aunties had sewn clothes. And now all of it was gone. Her mother didn't hide her disappointment. Her father, ever the silent punisher, simply packed her bags without a word. This is where cultural expectations add another layer of pain. In many traditional households, especially in African and Asian families, a woman's purity and marriageability are tied to her family's honor. So when that crumbles, the fallout isn't just emotional, it's generational shame. Grace was shipped off to her grandmother's house like damaged goods. But what she found there wasn't punishment. It was unexpected grace. Her grandmother didn't lecture her. She didn't slap or scream. She simply opened the door wearing oversized sunglasses, sipped Zobo from a crystal cup, and told Grace, "You're lucky I already boiled rice. Come in before the mosquitoes join your shame." That was the first time Grace cracked a smile in weeks. Sometimes we don't need rescue. We need presence. We need someone to look at our mess and still say, "Come inside." Over the next few weeks, Grace tried to rebuild. She focused on her final clearance, tried to keep her head down, and avoided places where gossip dripped like faucet leaks. But then came the nausea, then the late period, then the pregnancy test. 3 tests, actually. All 3 confirmed the one thing Grace hoped wasn't true. She was pregnant, and this time there was no one to blame but herself. She screamed the kind of scream that only heartbreak plus panic plus shame can produce. When her parents found out, the reaction was nuclear. Her mother turned into a Nollywood character, calling down fire and thunder on the unknown man responsible. Her father didn't say a word, just packed her boxes again. "This disgrace cannot stay under my roof," he said. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't ask what she needed. That's often the tragedy in families ruled by image over intimacy. No one asks if the hurting person is still breathing. They just ask if the neighbors know. Grace moved back in with Grandma, who handled the scandal the only way she knew how, with humor, sharp wisdom, and unconditional loyalty. After Grace told her everything, the betrayal, the stranger, the pregnancy, Grandma didn't flinch. She just nodded and said, "Then go and find him." Grace blinked. "Find who?" "The man that planted this national news in your belly," Grandma replied. "He deserves to know he's a father. You can't raise a child on vibes and bitterness. Real talk. Because in truth, children ask questions. And if you don't have answers, they go looking for their own." Grace returned to Elixir Lounge, hoping to find a clue and name something. But the receptionist shook her head. "We don't give out customer information." Grandma tried negotiating, then threatening, then praying out loud in Yoruba. Nothing worked. Grace walked away with a heavier heart. The truth was gone with the sunrise. So she did what women have done for centuries when life throws a wrecking ball into their future. She adapted. She focused. She survived. She entered law school, kept her head up, and let the whispers roll off her like rain on a tin roof. Her baby bump became the topic of hallway gossip. "Who's the father? I heard he's abroad. I heard he's imaginary." One girl even asked, "Are you keeping it?" Grace didn't flinch. She replied, "Are you keeping your ignorance?" and kept walking. This is where we highlight the power of self-possession. Grace may have made a mistake, but she refused to let that define her entire narrative. She was building something new from the ashes of her past, one bold step at a time, and she didn't need approval to do it. 5 years after the chaos that upended her youth, Grace stood in her home office as a transformed woman. No longer the trembling girl who walked out of a betrayal or cried into hotel sheets after a one-night stand, she was now a courtroom lioness, respected, sharp, unrelenting. Her baby girl Mia had not been a detour in her life. She had been the very fuel that drove Grace to conquer every room she entered. Mia was born on a rainy Tuesday, her cries echoing in the hospital room like thunder. And from the moment Grace saw the strange, dark birthmark curled on Mia's left shoulder, a mark shaped like a question mark, she knew her daughter would one day come asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. That birthmark wasn't just skin, it was a story, a symbol, a reminder. Grace whispered to her newborn, "You're carrying a story I'm still trying to understand." And as Mia grew, so did the mystery. She had her mother's fire, her grandmother's mouth, and a stubbornness that was all her own. Let's pause here. In real life, single mothers who are abandoned or unsupported often describe their children not as burdens, but as unexpected anchors. Psychologists call it post-traumatic resilience, the idea that enduring severe pain can lead to unshakable strength when given purpose. Grace embodied that. She didn't become a victim of her story. She became the author of its next chapter. She took every legal case that came her way, messy divorces, inheritance disputes, even a bizarre case where one woman sued her cousin for stealing all the plantain in a family soup pot. Grace didn't just win cases, she earned respect. She built her reputation one battle at a time until her victories started speaking louder than any billboard. Meanwhile, Mia grew into a full-blown character, loud, proud, unfiltered. One day at church, someone asked Mia if she was a daddy's girl. She replied, "No, I'm a two-women-raised-me type of girl." Grandma nearly dropped her purse from laughter. Another time, Grace was practicing her court argument in the living room when Mia clapped twice and said, "Okay, okay, okay, can I have custard now, or are we still pretending to be in court?" Moments like these weren't just cute. They were grounding. They reminded Grace of why she fought so hard. She wasn't just building a career, she was building an example. But beneath all that laughter and sass, real questions still lingered. One evening while munching on cheese balls, Mia asked, "Is my daddy real or cartoon?" Grace blinked. "Real." Mia squinted. "Then why don't we ever FaceTime him?" Another time, after a classmate told her she might have been made in a lab, Mia came home with teary eyes and heavy questions. Grace knelt, pulled her daughter close, and whispered, "You are not a science experiment. You are the best decision I ever made." She didn't lie, but she also didn't know what truth to give. Parenting without a script is hard. Parenting when you don't know the other half of the script is even harder, and yet Grace made it work. She built a home where laughter echoed louder than shame, where Mia didn't feel like she lacked anything, even if questions still danced around the edges. Then came the email that changed everything. One morning, Grace opened her inbox to find a message from one of the top 3 law firms in the country, Blake and Rowe LLP. They had followed her work, her victories, her presence, and they wanted her, not as an assistant, not as a trainee, as senior counsel. The message read, "We'd like you to handle a special litigation for our firm. If successful, you'll be offered a full-time position." Grace sat frozen. Her grandmother walked in, read the email, and screamed like a lottery winner. "Your mommy has been hired by rich people." Mia, not missing a beat, asked, "Do they have ice cream in the fridge? Because that's how I'll know if they're really rich." That's the thing about raising a child like Mia. There's never a dull moment. And while Grace prepared for this new job, Mia prepared a new set of questions. "Will my new daddy be working there too?" she asked with complete sincerity. Grace choked on her tea. "Excuse me, big firms must have big daddies," Mia replied. "I'm just asking." This was the rhythm of their life, unexpected, layered, hilarious, and full of questions Grace was not ready to answer. And on her first day at the new firm, everything came to a head. Because while Grace prepared her briefcase and kissed her daughter goodbye with a nervous smile, she had no idea that the very man who haunted her memories, the one-night stranger whose name she never asked, was walking into the same building with his own sense of purpose. Ethan Kingsley. The man who had left Nigeria 6 years ago to grow his legal empire abroad. The man who hadn't stopped thinking about a mystery woman who disappeared before he could even ask her name. The man who had no idea he had a daughter until that morning. And fate, in its quiet genius, had decided to put them both in the same place. Same building, same hallway, same unanswered story. The day started like any other, filled with hurried morning routines and negotiations between a mother and her defiant 5-year-old. Grace stood at the entrance of the staff daycare, trying to convince Mia to go inside. It was supposed to be simple. Drop Mia off, impress the new UK-based boss, secure her position in one of the country's most prestigious law firms. But nothing is ever simple when your child is Mia. She stood with her hands on her hips, refusing to step through the daycare doors. Her reasons were absurdly hilarious. One child had drooled on his shoe. Another was chewing a red crayon like candy. And the caretaker smelled, according to Mia, like forgotten milk. Grace was sweating, praying, and silently begging her daughter to cooperate. Real-life parents will tell you, especially single mothers balancing careers and childcare, that these moments are painfully familiar. You're one meeting away from a life-changing opportunity, and your child decides to stage a moral protest over the color of a balloon or the texture of apple slices. Finally, Grace promised everything from chocolate syrup to rainbow sprinkles just to get Mia inside. The child gave in, but not without flair. "I'm only staying here because I love you," she said dramatically. Grace sighed in relief and headed upstairs to the 7th floor. She didn't know that fate was already arranging a far bigger drama just a few floors below. Mia, the queen of unexpected detours, lasted exactly 7 minutes in daycare. Just enough time to spot a red balloon floating across the hall like it had a secret mission. With curiosity as her compass, Mia left the daycare, quietly chasing the balloon down the corridor. It bounced toward the lobby, rolling like it was guiding her to someone. That's when she bumped into Ethan. Hard. The balloon disappeared. She fell to the ground with a tiny thud. Ethan turned, startled. He knelt, immediately, concern written across his face. "Are you okay?" Mia, unbothered by the collision, stared up at the tall man and replied, "You walk like you're going to war." Ethan blinked. He didn't expect wit from such a small person. "I'm sorry," he said. "Where's your mom?" "She's working," Mia said proudly. "She's the best lawyer in this office." Ethan smiled. "Really? What's her name?" Mia hesitated, then tilted her head and squinted. "Wait, who are you?" He laughed softly. "I'm Ethan. I'm the CEO of this company," Mia gasped. "You're the big boss, so you're rich," Ethan chuckled. "Something like that." "I like you already," she declared. "Please be nice to my mommy. She works too much and forgot my juice box twice last week." Ethan nodded, completely charmed. But then something unexpected happened. Mia scratched her shoulder. Her dress shifted slightly, and Ethan saw it, a dark curved birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a bent question mark. His breath caught. His face stiffened. The world around him dulled. That birthmark, it was his. The same one he had carried since childhood. He had never met anyone else with that exact pattern. Until now. He stared, confusion colliding with disbelief. "Who's your daddy?" he asked quietly. Mia blinked. Just as she was about to answer, Ethan's assistant came running down the hallway. "The board meeting started 20 minutes ago. Everyone's waiting." Ethan blinked again. He turned to her quickly. "Wait, what's your mommy's name again?" Mia beamed. "I'm Mia. My mommy is Grace. She's the best lawyer in this whole company." And just like that, Ethan's entire past came rushing back to him like a tidal wave. Grace, the mystery woman who vanished after that unforgettable night. The woman he couldn't forget. The woman he hadn't seen since. Now here she was, working in his company, raising a little girl with his birthmark, his daughter. But he said nothing. He turned slowly and walked toward the elevator, his mind in shock. This wasn't just another employee. This wasn't coincidence. This was his past crashing into his future in the form of a little girl with his blood and her mother's fire. Meanwhile, Mia, unaware that she had just detonated a time bomb, turned back toward the daycare. Miss Beatrice, the daycare attendant, caught her at the door. "Mia, where did you go?" "I was chasing a balloon," she said casually. "Then I met the CEO. He's rich. I told him to be nice to my mommy." She walked back in like she hadn't just changed someone's life forever. Let's pause and consider the emotional weight of this moment. Ethan had spent years wondering about the girl who walked into his life and vanished before sunrise. He had buried it under work, under ambition, under time. But trauma doesn't dissolve. It waits, it lives in quiet corners. And when it returns, it doesn't knock. It explodes. In that split second, Ethan learned he had a daughter, a living, breathing, brilliant child he never knew existed. And that knowledge came not through a conversation or a letter, but from a 5-year-old chasing a balloon in a corporate hallway. Real life is never scripted, but this moment reads like something even a writer would hesitate to create because it's too raw, too coincidental, too explosive. Yet life does that. It pulls threads together when we least expect it. And in this story, those threads are just beginning to tighten. As the elevator doors slid shut behind Ethan, his reflection stared back at him like a ghost with answers he wasn't ready for. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in years echoed in his mind, Grace. The girl who had disappeared after one night of connection and silence. The girl who had entered his life through pain and left before daylight. The girl whose daughter just called her mommy. The girl whose daughter had his birthmark. Every second inside that elevator was a war zone of memories. And with every floor descending to the boardroom, Ethan knew two things with absolute certainty. First, the girl named Mia was his child. Second, Grace had known and said nothing. Let's stop here to understand what this moment really means. We often imagine finding out you have a child you never knew existed as cinematic or joyful. But in reality, it's destabilizing. It's grief, anger, wonder, and guilt all battling each other in the space of a single breath. For Ethan, a man who lived his life by logic and control, this news was chaos with a pulse. He didn't know whether to be angry that Grace never told him or amazed that fate had pulled them back into the same orbit. Meanwhile, Grace had no idea what had just unfolded a few floors below. She was busy prepping for her first big case in the new firm, unaware that her carefully rebuilt world had just been spotted by the one person she thought was permanently part of her past. While Ethan sat in that board meeting half present and wholly distracted, his mind kept flashing to that little girl's eyes, her posture, her wit. There was no doubt. He didn't need a paternity test. The universe had just slapped him with the truth using a balloon and a 5-year-old who looked like she ruled small countries for fun. But this wasn't just about genetics. This was about time. Time lost. Time never given. 5 years of birthdays, lullabies, and scraped knees that he had missed, and no one had told him. Let's look at the real-world implications of hidden parenthood. According to family law experts, secret pregnancies and unknown paternity create emotional, legal, and psychological complications that can ripple across generations. The parent who didn't know often feels robbed, while the child grows up with questions they may not even know how to ask until they're much older. That night, Ethan returned to his temporary condo, stood by the massive glass window overlooking the city, and tried to breathe. But he couldn't. He kept replaying that hallway moment. Her voice, the birthmark, her mother's name. There was no denying it anymore. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. He just sat there in the silence, stunned by how one random morning had rewritten everything he thought he knew. Elsewhere, Grace was going through her bedtime routine with Mia. Pajamas, cheese balls, and attitude. Mommy, Mia asked, stuffing snacks into her mouth. Why do I have a birthmark and you don't? Grace paused. Everyone's body is different. Is it from my daddy? Mia asked. Grace's spoon froze midair. Maybe she said softly. So he has it too. I don't know. Grace whispered more to herself than to Mia. But now she had to consider the real possibility that Ethan, the man she thought had vanished into thin air, was closer than she could handle. Mia kept asking questions. Grace kept dodging them with a soft smile and redirecting snacks. But questions don't vanish. They evolve. They grow with the child. They build stories in the silence that truth refuses to fill. In the days that followed, Ethan didn't approach Grace immediately. He watched. He observed. He tried to gather the facts like the lawyer he was. Was she married? Did she have a partner? Was Mia adopted? Could it be a coincidence? But deep down he knew, and that knowledge began to consume him. At night he stared at the ceiling. During meetings he lost focus. He began avoiding his colleagues' questions, and instead pulled up employee files, searching for anything that would confirm what he already believed. And there it was, Grace's record. 5 years of local legal work, a single name listed under dependents, Mia. No father's name, no other contacts, just her and her daughter. Ethan closed the file and leaned back in his chair, eyes closed trying to process the storm. How do you confront someone about a child they never told you about? How do you say, hey, remember that night 5 years ago when we were strangers, surprise, we're parents now? There's no manual for that, but life rarely waits for you to find the right words. And as the week drew to a close, fate began setting the stage for a confrontation that would demand not just honesty, but vulnerability, pain, forgiveness, and maybe even a second chance. By the end of the week, Ethan's silence had become a cage, each bar made of questions he couldn't ignore anymore. His instincts as a lawyer demanded evidence, but his instincts as a man, possibly a father, demanded answers. And the more he tried to keep the matter logical, the more it became emotional. There was a little girl who looked like him, talked like a miniature hurricane, and carried his birthmark like a secret the universe had left behind just for him to find. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't go another day pretending everything was normal. That Monday morning, Grace had no idea that her life was about to change again. She was balancing legal briefs in one hand, her phone in the other, and trying to talk Mia into staying in the daycare without issuing a full-scale protest. Mia, ever the negotiator, had her demands: gummy worms, cartoon privileges, and 3 extra hugs. Grace fulfilled the first 2 with minor eye rolls, and the last with genuine affection. After all, she didn't know how many mornings like this she'd get before her daughter began asking harder questions. Questions Grace still didn't have the language to answer. Downstairs in the firm's executive suite, Ethan stood in front of his office window again, rehearsing the conversation he'd been avoiding for days. What do you say to the woman who unknowingly gave you a daughter, but disappeared before you could even learn her name? He didn't know if Grace had intentionally kept Mia a secret, or if she had even known how to contact him. Maybe she thought he had left the country forever. Maybe she thought he wouldn't care. But he did, more than he wanted to admit. Finally, he made a decision. He called his assistant and said, schedule Grace for a private case briefing. No interruptions. Grace received the calendar invite and raised an eyebrow. It was unexpected. The CEO rarely got personally involved in preliminary case strategy. But she didn't question it. She reviewed her notes, adjusted her blazer, and walked up to the top floor like she owned the place. When she entered the office, the tension hit her like a gust of wind. Ethan stood by the window, hands clasped, eyes distant. For a brief second, she didn't recognize him. Then something clicked. The jawline, the posture, the silence. She froze. He turned slowly. Their eyes met, and the room went still. Grace, he said softly. She didn't respond, just stared. Her body knew before her mind caught up. Ethan, she finally whispered. You work here, I run this firm, he replied. Then another pause. A heartbeat passed. Mia, he said. Is she mine? Grace opened her mouth, but no words came out. The truth sat on her tongue like burning coal. The answer was yes. Yes, she is. Yes, I didn't know how to find you. Yes, I thought it would ruin everything. But she couldn't say it. Not yet. Ethan stepped forward slowly, not with anger, but with something closer to ache. I didn't know. Not until I saw her. Not until I saw that mark. Grace sat down, her strength giving way to years of secrecy. I didn't know how to find you, she said finally. You left. I left. We didn't exchange anything. I thought you were just passing through. Ethan nodded. I was, but you stayed in my mind longer than one night ever should. The room pulsed with unsaid things. Grace wiped her palms on her skirt. I didn't plan to hide her. I didn't even know until months later. By the time I tried to trace anything, it was too late. You named her Mia, yes. She's incredible, he said. She really is, Grace smiled faintly. She's a lot like you, loud, curious, stubborn. Ethan chuckled, then silence again. The kind that doesn't beg to be filled. The kind that carries weight. Real-life reunions like these aren't always this composed. Sometimes they involve screaming, sometimes tears, sometimes the door slamming shut. But sometimes, especially when both people have grown up through pain, The reaction is quieter, more tender, like both know they're walking across glass. Ethan sat down opposite her. I want to know her. I want to be part of her life. Grace looked at him, the lawyer in her brain doing mental risk assessments while the mother in her heart was melting. It won't be easy, she said. She doesn't even know your name. Then let me tell her. Let me earn it. There it was, the offer, the reaching hand, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of a desire to know the little girl who called Grace mommy and had a question mark tattooed by destiny on her shoulder. That evening, Grace picked up Mia from daycare and told her they were having dinner with a new friend. Mia, ever the detective, asked if the friend was rich, smart, or had snacks. Grace smiled and said he might have all three. At the restaurant, Ethan waited nervously. Mia approached him like a queen inspecting her knight. He stood. She squinted. Do you have any snacks in your pocket? No, he replied nervously. But I know where to find the best ice cream in the city. She grinned. You'll do. And with that, they sat and ate and talked. And somewhere between dessert and laughter, a new chapter began to write itself slowly, imperfectly, but finally together. It didn't happen overnight. Trust, after all, isn't a faucet you can turn back on with a single dinner and dessert. But something had shifted after that restaurant meeting, and not just for Mia. Grace felt it too. The unease that had clung to her heart for years, wondering if she'd done the right thing by raising Mia alone, unsure if the man from that night would ever show up again, fearful that one day Mia's questions would arrive faster than her answers, had finally started to loosen. Ethan didn't force his way into their lives. He didn't try to sweep them into a new lifestyle or throw money at the situation like a cliche. He showed up with consistency. He asked questions. He made time. He was late once and apologized the entire next day, even bringing Mia the rainbow ice cream she'd mentioned weeks ago. Real parenting doesn't start with the big gestures. It starts with remembering the small things. The color of your child's favorite shoes, the way they scrunch their nose when they're lying, the bedtime song that never works but feels like comfort anyway. Ethan learned all of this from scratch, and Mia, sharp as ever, didn't make it easy. One day she told him, "You're lucky you have my birthmark, or I would have needed DNA." Another day she asked if he ever danced, and when he said no, she looked disappointed and told him Mommy's still winning. But slowly she warmed. Grace watched it all with cautious eyes and a full heart. She wasn't just protecting her child, she was protecting her own healing, and Ethan seemed to understand that. They co-parented awkwardly at first, sharing pickups, switching weekends, sitting at birthday parties together without knowing if they should bring one cake or two. But with every shared smile, every shared moment, the walls came down. One night after Mia had gone to bed, Ethan and Grace sat on the couch, both sipping ginger tea, both silent. He finally said, "I used to wonder why that night stayed with me. I thought it was guilt or fantasy, but now I know it was unfinished." Grace looked at him. "It still is." He nodded. "But we get to write the rest, don't we?" And that's what they did, slowly, no pressure. Just a shared willingness to try, to forgive, to learn who they had become outside of the pain that once defined them. Grace was no longer the heartbroken student. Ethan was no longer the stranger passing through. They were parents, teammates, maybe something more. One afternoon, Mia asked if the three of them could wear matching t-shirts for family day at school. Grace hesitated. "Are we a family?" Mia blinked. "Of course, we just use different rules." Out of the mouths of children come the simplest truths. Families aren't always made in the traditional way. Sometimes they're formed out of chaos and rebuilt through intentional choices. And that's the real heart of this story. It isn't just about a one-night stand. It isn't just about a lost man finding his daughter. It's about how healing isn't linear, about how forgiveness doesn't erase pain, but makes room for something new to grow in its place, about how some marks, like a question mark-shaped birthmark, are not flaws, but reminders that every life has a mystery and every person is part of a larger story waiting to be discovered. Grace continued her work in law, rising through the ranks not because of her past, but in spite of it. Ethan continued to lead the firm, now balancing power with purpose. And Mia, she remained a whirlwind of questions, dance moves, and snack negotiations, still reminding them every day that love like her never follows a script. And as the years went by, they became something that most people never expected, a family. Not because they fit the mold, but because they rewrote it, because they chose each other again and again. So what can we take away from this story? First, that one moment does not define your worth. Grace's story could have ended in shame, but she chose growth. Second, that children don't need perfect families, they need present parents. Mia didn't ask for a perfect father. She asked for ice cream bedtime stories and honesty. Third, that second chances are real. They're not always neat. They're not always deserved. But when handled with care, they can transform lives. And lastly, that sometimes the things we think will break us, the betrayal, the silence, the unexpected detours end up leading us to exactly where we're meant to be. So the next time life takes an unexpected turn, when you feel like your story has gone off script, remember Grace, Ethan, and Mia. Remember the girl who walked away from betrayal, the man who found more than he was looking for, and the little girl who turned a birthmark into a map back to love. Because sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we plan, they're the ones that find us.